Oh, yeah.
Almost there.
Seem to be. Oh, I get notification before you do every time that we're streaming. So.
It's always exciting, Mark. You know, while I'm doing that, we're going to have to work on you doing the drum roll. Okay, so we'll work on it. Well, it looks like we are live once again for an incredibly special episode of Uplink. Mark, not just for the reasons of our wonderful guest who is joining us in just a few minutes' time, but also because it's an extraordinary anniversary that we're celebrating today. Mark, tell us a little bit about Hubble's 30th.
Yeah, so I think, you know, if you're living somewhere in the world where you haven't heard about the 30th anniversary of the launch of Hubble Space Telescope today, well, you're probably not watching this either. So indeed, April the 24th, 1990, Hubble Space Telescope was launched on Space Shuttle Discovery. After years and years of preparation, in fact, it was Hermann Oberth talked about observatories in space in the 20s. And the kind of key figure in this is Lyman Spitzer, an astrophysicist at Princeton who started promoting, designing, putting together a project, even in the 1940s, late 1940s. Started to get built in the 70s and very complicated project. So lots and lots of issues, delays. European Space Agency joined in. So we've always been partners with NASA from the beginning in this project. And it was launched in 1990, but of course, as many people remember, it had a problem when it arrived on orbit. Its main mirror was polished slightly the wrong shape. It was very, very smooth, but it was in just the wrong shape. And it meant that it had images which were, technically, we call that spherical aberration. Effectively, stars came out with sharp cores and fuzzy halos around them. And that caused a major controversy in many ways. It was widely covered in the world as being a catastrophe, a failure, egg on everybody's faces. But through the ingenuity of the engineers involved and, if you like, the bravery of the astronauts who were able to go up there and service Hubble, not just once, but many times, to replace components, to put new instruments in, but in the early 90s to fix the spherical aberration with corrective optics. Hubble has become, since then, this astonishingly productive science machine with discoveries ranging from exoplanets to disks going around stars in Orion, which I was involved in many years ago. And very famously, this incredibly deep image of the universe, a series of them. They're often called the Hubble Deep Fields, which let you see all the way back to the beginning of the universe, effectively, the very earliest galaxies ever to form. So I think those 30 years have yielded astonishing science across the world. Everybody's free to apply to it. It's NASA and ESA as a project, but anybody can apply. Whole generations of astronomers have grown up with it. It's been a huge influence on my career, as I've just been going on about on Twitter. But it's had this iconic public impact as well. There isn't a school in the world probably that hasn't seen a textbook or a poster on the wall with Hubble imagery. And those sort of classic look of Hubble images is famous, the way that the images are put together. So I think the public influence that there has been around Hubble over these past 30 years has probably, the impact on astronomy has probably been just as great in the general public mind as it has been in astrophysics itself. So it's a fantastic birthday. It's not the end. Hubble goes on. Hubble, we will continue to run it with NASA for years to come. And of course, we're already building, and we've talked about it before, we'll come back to it again, we're building the James Webb Space Telescope, which is nearly finished, ready for launch, hopefully next year, all sorts of coronavirus issues notwithstanding. So Hubble, but it's a complement to Hubble, it's not a replacement, and it'll do things that Hubble can't do, and Hubble can do things that JWST will never be able to do. So yeah, it's a great day for astronomy, and long may it go on.
Indeed. Well, I think, here to that, I'm just, it's truly an instrument that's utterly changed our view of the world. But, I suppose, before the Hubble Space Telescope relied on other things, and certainly we still do the world of imagination. And I guess that's what makes today's guest, Bryan Fuller, such a wonderful person, because, he truly is responsible for the most iconic episodes of Star Trek, but also he's created so many other worlds that have, I guess, blown so many minds, and I guess that's what we want to talk to him about, is when did he fall in love with it, and how did this world of space influence where he came from. So I guess that's a pretty good intro, I'd say. And why don't we bring Bryan in? It's going to take just a moment. A very lovely man with a very large mug of coffee. It's 10 a.m. in LA, and we are receiving.
Good morning.
Good morning, Bryan. How are you doing?
Good.
Morning,
How are
Bryan.
you?
I'm
Good morning.
Very well. Well, yeah, absolutely delighted to have you on Uplink. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone for joining us. It's funny, because we're just talking about the 30th anniversary of the Hubble Space Telescope, which makes today a really special day in the world of space exploration. But what people watching won't actually realize is there's another reason why we chose today. It's because it's pretty close, of course, to Alien Day. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Alien Day is LV426, is the planet Acheron that was named in the novelization for Aliens. And so since LV426 is very close to April 26, it has been adopted first by the Alien fan base and then by the studio itself in an official capacity. So Alien Day is April 26 after LV426.
It's a big day. And, I mean,
it's Sunday.
What's the tradition? This is you guys have just immediately caught me off guard. What are you supposed to do on Alien Day? I hate to ask.
I think you're either supposed to infest somebody and crawl out of their chest, or perhaps just watch an alien movie.
Well, I think the first part of that we're all trying not to do anyway, but at the moment, right?
Right. Don't inject bleach to kill infestations.
Yes, indeed. And I guess speaking of the questions at the moment, how are you coping? Are you holed up at home and writing, being creative? How are you dealing?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, because I'm doing exactly what I would be doing anyway, which is staying home and writing on deadline until June. So on that level, it hasn't affected me immediately in terms of my day in, day out. But then you take into consideration just sort of all of those low-key stressors, the community stressors and social stressors, and realize, gosh, I've gone from sleeping 7.5 hours a night to 9.5 hours a night. Like, am I depressed? Those types of things. But really the day in, day out is continuing to write. And then at 8 o'clock, I go and play my snare drum on the balcony for the healthcare workers and first responders and those folks. So it hasn't affected me as dramatically, just because of the nature of my business. But I'm definitely sending out positive energy to all of our frontline workers.
Yeah, well, I think amen to that on behalf of everyone. I mean, it's such a strange scenario, of course, because of course, for many of us, we're experiencing like a radical transformation. But I mean, you talked a bit about your writing process and almost, I guess, disappearing into your own world. So what is that process like? What does a day in your life look like?
Well, really, it's just about pouring a big cup of coffee, going down and sitting in front of my computer and then walking the dog. So it's it really is. Thomas Harris, who wrote the Hannibal novels, has this wonderful expression about needing to show up every day at your computer just in case your characters show up. And so I adopt that policy where I'm here in front of my desk every day, often for 12 hours a day, hoping that the characters show up or walk by and I can jot down what they have to say to me.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, I suppose by now it's a fairly beautifully refined process, but I guess it's probably every day is different.
No, it's all like every day is sort of like, oh God, I have no ideas left. And then it's like, wee, inspiration.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I mean, I guess I've got to ask, just when did you first fall in love with it all? Was it with literature? Was it a specific show? I mean, just when did you first feel that tug at your heartstrings and decide that you wanted to write?
I to want to be a writer, like to actually be a writer. I mean, I was engaged in as an audience member, of course, from a very early stage with Star Trek and the Twilight Zone, and watching my oldest brother, who's 10 years older than me, build models of Klingon cruisers and fly them through the house with lights, and all of the lights had been turned off in the house. So all of that kind of like activated my imagination with space travel in a very basic way, because I was like, what is that? It's a spaceship. What does that do? And then being introduced to the narratives of Star Trek and having seeing the reruns, and also I'm a big horror genre fan, and what I loved about my early experience with those episodes of Star Trek is that there were a lot of horror stories in the original series, whether it was The Devil in the Dark, where you have a monster that is eating miners, and then you realize that it is protecting its eggs, and so it has this wonderful Roddenberryan aspect of looking at life through a different prism. So we aren't projecting on it what we are thinking it wants to do. We're actually trying to understand it for what it is. So really, Star Trek was such a imagination exploder for me as a child, because it just took my brain in directions I never anticipated it going. I imagine for a lot of people who watch this and work in this environment have been impacted greatly by Star Trek.
I would say that's equally true. In fact, in my environment, whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars or science fiction in general, often people will say, well, there's a division between these two worlds. There's science fact and there's science fiction, and something that Alex and I have been working on a lot to show. No, not at all. The inspiration that you can see in many films and many TV shows comes from what we can see in the real universe, but it goes the other way, because many of us are interested in sort of escaping from those boring rules of physics that we all have to obey, right, and actually being able to go to the center of the Milky Way, to go through a black hole. And there's a crossover, because we actually end up turning science fiction into science over time in many ways. And I've seen that in my lifetime. You've seen it in yours, right? We've actually, things that were impossible 20, 30 years ago, we're doing it. Yeah, exactly. We're doing it right now. There's your communicator, the tricorder. Right?
Yeah, and my tricorder too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess, Mark, from your perspective, I mean, working for something like the European Space Agency, I mean, it must happen all the time where you're talking to people, who did grow up with, Gene Roddenberry's kind of like, original vision, and that just kind of created the spark. And I guess what's remarkable about what Bryan is saying is it's led people in all kinds of directions, which is really quite something.
Yeah, I mean, it's always ironic when you meet somebody in the space industry who hasn't seen 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I'm thinking of Libby out there. One of our friends, head of human exploration at the UK Space Agency, has never seen 2001. What's that about? But that's not particularly normal. But then you get the kind of infighting, right? You're Trekkie. Are you a Star Wars fan? We go every year, as Alex knows. We go to a big science fiction convention here in Europe called FedCon.
Right.
Sci-fi convention, and have you been over for that one?
No, but I've seen it advertised, and I've dreamt of going.
Yeah, you should come when it gets, this year, of course, it's been postponed or maybe even cancelled. But the great thing there is that because we go and give talks about what we do in space, and we have big audiences who are interested in hearing about the real space, we get to go backstage and speak to people like you, the writers, the actors, the other people who are there. Without naming names, some of the actors are sort of, this is just a job. I'm just an actor. When I'm off stage, I go and have a coffee. But some are really engaged, some of the actors as well, and that's a thrill for us, because it means that they are interested in what's really going on. It's not just a job.
Well, it's a dream. It's feeding the dreams in such a wonderful way, because I think all of us who go out at night and look at the sky and look at the moon through a romantic lens. There's great romance and the exploration of space, and romance and storytelling are integral to one another in a way that we can't help but dream of possibilities and alternate scenarios and things that will take us out there and what is out there. So all of those wonderful questions where, the mechanisms in our brains that may, for some of us, fall to a God source, for others, it falls to a sense of exploration and a sense of wonder at the unknown. And I think, there's an interesting aspect of some of our brains that just assume an answer, and then all the neurons coagulate around that and solidify, and it becomes an impenetrable notion. And others of us like to ask the questions and don't necessarily need to know for a fact, but we like the adventure of pursuing that knowledge. And it's an interesting adaptive quality of our brains that were designed to worship a God source, and this kind of strange secularist function of what that awe is.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, because one of the things that we talked about, in the sort of the course of creating Space Rocks, is just how space does speak to those two levels, the intellect and perhaps whatever we might describe as, just like our what you describe as like our romance, just like our love of things. We respond to space with an intellectual question, but also with an emotional response that leads to art, which leads to writing as well. And so I guess that's the sort of almost like the genetic code. It just seems to be intertwined, in that way. But I have to ask though, because of course we are talking so close to Alien Day. Number one, is that a xenomorph behind you? A few people have actually asked.
Yes, that is my partner got me that a few years ago. It's a prop from Alien 3. It's one of their, they would have that on a stick and poke it around corners for certain shots. So it's one of my favorite movies. It's definitely a movie that excited my sense of exploration in a way that Star Trek did. And it was kind of a wonderful yes and to the Star Trek universe, in that it Star Trek is very paramilitary. It has this wonderful kind of organization that gives you a sense of structure and hope and authority. And I loved that Alien was kind of the antidote to that in many ways, that it was space truckers, and it had this kind of everyman appeal to it that I think Star Trek was always something that I loved, and I loved going to those worlds, but I also knew that I didn't belong in any sort of paramilitary situation just because I don't like the rules that much. So Alien was a way to kind of get into space without going to join the army.
I mean, I think I'm just picking up on that. One of the shows that Alex and I mutually love currently is The Expanse. And the fact that it plays that, that people can be in the military, people are, government people are also just workers. They're just having a life. And this idea that when you cross the line going to space, that you change into a whole different species, either one way or the other. No, we're just going to be humans wherever we are. We're going to do human stuff.
Assholes in space.
Yeah, just with less gravity, maybe, right? And
yeah. Well, this
so
is...
I wanted to pick up on a question there, though, because the breadth of your work has been, from things like Star Trek, which you could argue in some sense is hard sci-fi. Okay, there are magic technologies like teleporters, transporters. But in a sense, by having ships and having ways of moving around in a physical way, they're not mythical, they're not mystical. Then you go to something like American Gods, which of course is something totally different in that regard. So my question to you is, what stimulates the most, if at all? Is it sticking to the rules or breaking the rules? Is it really about using science fiction as a storytelling device, or is it kind of saying, well, this could be a real future?
Well, I think it's about the tether to reality when you're telling a story. It's like how long that tether goes, and how long, or what's the whipping ratio when it gets long enough for you to be spun around an idea. So the Star Trek is very interesting because there's this, the biggest buy-in to Star Trek is that we as human beings lost the capacity to be major assholes. We're minor assholes in a way that drama kind of needs that abrasion. But we've evolved past money, we've evolved past certain authoritarian instincts, and we are now focused on the greater good of our species because we've unified. There's been some sort of unifying event in our history that allowed us to kind of, not sweat the small stuff anymore. And that's the biggest fantasy, I think, of Star Trek, is that we're like capable as of people to get to that point. So that's the biggest buy, I would say. But all the technology, like I remember when I first was watching Star Trek, I loved the technobabble. I loved that they would say reroute power to the tertiary inducers to reinforce the rear shield matrix or what have you. All of that, I was like, oh my God, it's real. Like it's accessible. They're talking about stuff. And it felt really kind of, it was wonderful world building because I was like, oh my God, those are the buttresses for me to buy that this can all happen. And the further I've gotten into my writing as a writer, the more I realize like, oh, that it's a buttress in many ways. It's a buttress for character, it's a buttress for plot, but it does actually help frame a world. And then within that world, you have to get to the characters. And then you have to get to the sense of exploration and the sense of why those individuals are out there doing what they're doing. And that's where the real meat of the storytelling lies.
Well, I mean, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that one thing before you jump back in, Alex. That lovely idea about that sort of utopia, if you like, as you say, with slightly prickly edges. Immediately reminded me of the way Ian M. Banks wrote his science fiction books about the culture. I mean, that was all true in the culture, but many of the stories were about special circumstances and contact. The point where this cuddly utopian world just didn't work, and you had all sorts of the real rough edges, and those are where the interesting stories often are. So yeah, even in the culture, which was very utopian, I think Banks never lost sight of the fact that you needed to retain some degree of I don't know, a lack of naivety, because even if you had become utopian, there are always going to be people coming after you.
Well, I mean, look at what's happening now worldwide with the quarantine. There are real conversations now about providing base income structures to allow for people to live above poverty level across the board on the planet. And it taking a pandemic for us to sort of stop and say, well, we're not doing things very efficiently when you start to break it down and look at how society functions. And maybe we do need to adopt some of these more utopian, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren-esque qualities of how society should function to take care of the weakest amongst us, which is, the biggest indicator of any society is how they treat the weak. And I think we're failing on a global scale in that regard. And so there's something, I imagine and it is a nightmare scenario of us just going back to the way we were and looking at how our penetration into the environment has been so destructive, and we are seeing immediate results of what happens when humanity sets one out and lets the world heal. And yes, it introduces a lot of other problems that we have to solve, but those problems are solvable through a sense of socialization and politicking that is about serving mankind, not in the Twilight Zone way, how to serve mankind, but we might get to that. So it's interesting to have this conversation now with what's happening with the pandemic and what's happening to our response to the pandemic and the results that we're seeing undeniably in the world around us, and how are we going to acknowledge that and move forward toward a Roddenberry-esque future.
Indeed. Well, I guess that's the interesting question of the moment, isn't it? You know, and it's an interesting point in history for us, because in many ways there's the Roddenberry view of the future, and then there is the Weyland-Yutani view of the future, right?
Yes.
You know, and it's almost like, are we at that pivot point now where we are deciding what world we emerge to, but who we are as a species, you know, following something like this, which is, you know, and it's a question that we can't answer, but in many ways, I suppose science fiction often tries to answer. You know, it tries to imagine those things. And I guess, as you say so brilliantly, Gene Roddenberry's vision, it was always predicated on there was a great war, there was a great cataclysm before everyone decided, well, let's find a way to cooperate.
It gets worse before it gets better.
Indeed, indeed. You know, I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about those inspirations and so on. I mean, you didn't just mention Star Trek, but also the Twilight Zone as well. Was that the original Rod Serling series, or was that like the
Oh yeah,
kind of, yeah.
Oh, the 80s one I never really latched on to. I think there was something so elegant about the way Rod Serling told stories, and what I love, the Twilight Zone and Star Trek are so comparable to me, because they were both about fantastical stories as a delivery mechanism for great glances at humanity. It's sort of like if the episode was a marijuana brownie, and the sugar is the delivery mechanism for the marijuana to effectively hit your system in a sustainable way, that's what Star Trek and Twilight Zone were a wonderful marijuana brownie. And inside that brownie was something that elevated our imaginations to allow us to think differently about the world and ourselves. So I guess you know what my recreational drug of choice is.
Yeah, sugar, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me pick up on that. So, you know, you're a writer and a producer. You've got to work, you know, creatively in your mind. You've got to come up with it's your thing to imagine worlds, but then you have to get them made, right? And do you think perhaps, I mean, I'm watching a lot of series now since we're in lockdown, things I normally don't have time for, things which actually seem to be regenerating a world of imagination that perhaps 10 years ago, before all the streaming services, they become much more corporatized. You know, there was a way of, we're going to sell you a message, don't be too imaginative, because, you know, we don't want to spend money on that. Whereas now there seems to be almost a return to innovative ideas, much slower paced television, much more imaginative television. How do you see that as an opportunity for you? I mean, obviously you're in that genre, you're already writing those shows, but is that something we can look forward to, more Rod Serling's coming along?
I hope so. I think what's interesting now, we're sort of in this Weyland-Yutani phase of the corporatization of IP and the value of IP, and we are victims of our own instincts in terms of entertainment, because of course we're all going to perk up and say like, oh, you're talking about something that is familiar to me, whether it's Star Wars, Star Trek, or Alien. We're going to want to seek those things out to see how that story has continued for whatever way. And there is an exploitation of the sentimental aspects of how our brain processes entertainment. And you know, so much of there's this wonderful book called Blink, and there's a chapter on audience testing, and it says essentially that audience testing works when all of the elements are familiar and the audience can say, I like this greater than or less than something I have seen before that is similar. But if you show them something wholly original, they don't know quite how to process it. And as human beings, because we're innately assholes, we default to a criticism. And so audience testing of anything that is original always goes badly, because the audience does not have the vocabulary yet to say that they like Archie Bunker better than Edith for whatever reason, because they know those archetypes. And if it's something new, then there's an immediate rejection that we all have to get over, because we see something new and some of us step back. And even though there are those of us who lean into those things, our initial reaction is like, oh, what's that? Like, tell me more. But for a lot of the corporatization, they don't get past the like, what's that of it all, before they're moving on to the next thing that gets more of a lean and like, oh, I'm familiar with the Marvel movies. I'm familiar with the Star Wars movies and the Star Trek movies. And you're telling me there's going to be another one. What's this about? So we're so complicated in terms of our evolution that has been developed in a way to help us react and process to new information in a safe way, that it doesn't necessarily apply to how we adapt to entertainment. And I know for myself and my viewing habits, you need to be very special in order for me to stop what I'm doing to check out a television show. And I tune out of things faster than I tune into things.
Well, please
I've
go
been
ahead.
saving up Twin Peaks for years until my kids got old enough. And I actually even...
It's worth the wait. That's a good one.
I saw it when it first came out, and it was shockingly different television at the time. And I just wonder how shockingly different it will be today, because I haven't watched it since. I mean, of course, I'm aware of the tropes, and there's the new series, which I haven't seen. So I'm wondering, my kids, they watch TV in a completely different way. They get much more easily bored than I do. Their brains have been programmed. So I'm curious to see if Twin Peaks works kind of a second time so many years later.
It's interesting, the cycles that we go through in terms of entertainment as well. And just the older I get and the more I'm aware of all of the influences that modern day entertainment relies upon for many of the story ideas. Younger audiences are like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I was like, well, it's a ripoff of all of these other things. I mean, you can't get into an AI story anymore without falling back onto 2001 or any other kind of robot gone bad scenario. And for new audiences, they haven't seen it before. But for some of us older crows on the wire, we're like, well, I see you and I see your plagiarism, and step up your game.
Well, no, it's interesting though, because we've talked about 3 incredibly innovative shows. Obviously, 2 of which inspired you. But Alien, for its time was utterly innovative. Like no one had seen anything like it. Twilight Zone, again, when you look at what else was on TV, I mean, it's just stunning what Rod Serling was able to do. Same thing for Star Trek with Gene Roddenberry's vision. But, is the innovation not just in the concepts, but also in how characters are written as well? The kinds of interactions, the complexity of those things, because that's certainly something that I have seen evolve so much thanks to the kind of writing, the kind of producing that you've done.
Well, I think like looking at it in terms of execution and just like storyteller point of view, like if you look at something like Twin Peaks, which is a murder in a small town scenario, and we've seen those over the course of filmmaking and film stories. And what is unique about that is the distinctive quality of David Lynch's lens into that world and his sense of where to heighten emotion and where to tamp it down in a way. So when you have Laura Palmer's mother experiencing grief, she's experiencing it in a messy way that you've never seen before on any kind of story, because there's always some sort of like dignified way for a character to react to grief that doesn't scare the audience away. Whereas this was a messy, drug-addled woman who was living under a veil of pharmaceuticals, and also an abusive situation with her husband that we only get the taste of until further into the story and discover who the real monster is of the scenario. And that's distinctly David Lynch. That's something that he is bringing to the table as his exposure of growing up in the Pacific Northwest, which I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and it was weird, and people are weird, and and when I grew up there, I was like, oh my God, get me out of here. But as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, this is such a rich, fertile ground for me to draw on for characters, because everybody was bizarre in some way. My scoutmaster, my assistant scoutmaster was a serial killer when I was in Cub Scouts. So like there's anybody who's from the Pacific Northwest has those kinds of stories. So that's what David Lynch brought to it in a wonderful way. And I think if you look at at Alien, for instance, we've all seen stories of people trapped in a ship with a monster, like from the 50s, kind of Cold War infused science fiction horror films of that era. And then you look at what Ridley Scott did with it, just in terms of providing a filmic psychology to the story that we hadn't seen before. And for me, Alien was very influential because I saw the photo novel first. I don't know if you remember the photo novel, but it's this wonderful, I may even have it on my desk. No, it's over there. But it's just all the pictures laid out with dialogue bubbles in it, almost like a graphic novel. So for me, what that did as a 9-year-old in the grocery store waiting for my mom to get to the checkout aisle and hiding in the magazine section where I'd stashed this book behind the others so they couldn't return it or nobody could buy it and it'd always be there for me, I got to see how the images were influencing the story in a unique way that we hadn't seen before. And part of that is Giger's designs, where you have all of the biomechanics of the penis-headed monster, the vagina-shaped doors, like the derelict ship that looks like fallopian tubes in the way it's designed. So there was all of this wonderful psychology of our bodies betraying us, providing a bed of disturbing images that we may not necessarily be processing immediately in our viewing of the film, but are there planting seeds and making us a little uncomfortable because that monster does kind of look like a giant cock. And, you know, what does that mean? You know, there's something about that took the horror movie to a psychosexual level that we hadn't seen before, that made it all fresh. So like David Lynch was doing with Twin Peaks and having just this skewing our familiarity and our comfort level with messy human beings and their dealings with grief, Ridley Scott was taking our familiarity of ships and being in space and heightening the claustrophobia and also giving this twisted kind of view of our bodies inside and out. It was about male rape, which is taking certain violations that were used to happening to one member of our species, and then all of a sudden it's affecting the member of our species who's usually responsible for it. And the violation of that is all turning things on their ears in a way that we had never experienced before. So there's an alchemy to giving the audience just enough new stuff to make the old stuff new again, if that makes sense.
It does. And you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because as someone like yourself who has spent so much time inhabiting worlds, you know, creating new ones, you know, and many times translating, you know, books, you know, things like American Gods, you know, to the small screen. I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about Alien, because of course so much of that imagery was you know, related to H.R. Giger, right? You know, and like as if I recall my history correctly, he was discovered by Ridley Scott because he'd already been working on a film that many people feel is almost unmakeable, you know, Jodorowsky's version of Dune, you know, which of course is kind of like a question of the moment. Like, are there some stories that you just can't tell, things like of just like such scale epicness? Because of course Dune is, you know, it's a point of contention among so many people because it feels like it's never been gotten right, and all we're left with is kind of what Jodorowsky might have done with it all.
I'm a big defender of David Lynch's Dune, and just in terms of production design, and I do have an emotional experience every time I see that movie. I'm rooting for Paul Atreides and his mother to survive and right the wrongs that were committed against them. So I once again, it's David Lynch through a very specific interpretation of humanity and how we behave. So I love David Lynch's Dune, but I get that there is only so much that he could cover. Like the books are expansive worlds that are filled with such intricate details that it's hard to get them right or hard to get them in the ballpark of how other people have been imagining them, so they accept them as the truth of their experience in reading. And I'm very excited about the new version of Dune. I mean, I'm excited about any version of it because I'll check it out and let my audience experience determine. But I think we are in a place now technologically that really the only limitations are our imaginations. And granted, those are huge limitations, because not only do we have to imagine it as the storytellers, but we have to convince people who are going to open their coffers for us to be able to build those worlds in a way that they feel they will have a return on their investment. So I feel like what's exciting to me about a new series of Dune films, a new exploration of Lord of the Rings, there are so many things that previously weren't able to be achieved for whatever reason, and now they are. Like, one of the reasons why I wanted to adapt Hannibal is because there's so many things in the books about those characters that haven't made it through to any of the adaptations, that I was like, oh, there's still gold in them, there hills, so I'll get my pickaxe and my little tray for the water and find some gold. So that was an exciting thing for me. In American Gods, there were things that I was like, oh, I haven't seen this before on television, so let's try this out and see where this goes. And there is a sense of exploration that is indulgent on one level, because I think ultimately people watch television for characters. And one of the best things I've seen in a long time was Fleabag, that didn't have any sort of science fiction elements, but it did have genre storytelling perks, whether it was breaking the fourth wall or getting inside a character's head in a way that might not necessarily be what you would expect for this character to experience. But because they were like, well, I wanted to look at the audience and connect with them, and that feels honest and authentic in the moment, so I'm going to do it. And she did it, and it was a fantastic experience that took relationships to a genre level, because they were breaking down how we relate to each other in very kind of secular ways. But because romance was a final frontier for the Fleabag character, we got to go on a romantic, awe-inspiring journey into humanity for this woman, and it was exciting, as if it were a genre story, if that makes sense.
I just want to pick up on that. I'm kind of fascinated by that idea, because science fiction often takes itself way too seriously. The idea of breaking the fourth wall, apart from sort of comedies like Galaxy Quest and so on, which are commentary on science fiction tropes. But there's been a discussion floating around on the web today between the two writers of The Expanse, and people have been trying to push them into making a musical episode of The Expanse. As you might, there was one with Buffy, and occasionally this kind of crops up, and it's like, no, you can't do that. And yet, I suppose, why not, right? At what point, the story, when it's Fleabag, it's in the world we live in. So this idea of breaking the fourth wall and talking out and talking to the audience has a kind of a credibility which doesn't shatter the base story. If I do it on a spaceship light years away, and I suddenly turn around and say, actually, you're in the room with me, does it break things down completely, right?
Well, I think what you just underlined really is the the one big buy rule. Like for any sort of storytelling, you get one big buy. Whether it's Star Trek, it's one big buy is like we've got faster than light travel and there's alien species and the galaxy is a smaller place. And then the character dynamics kind of work within the parameters of that one big buy. For Fleabag, the one big buy was that she turns to address the audience, and the audience is her kind of, you know, invisible friend, for lack of a better example. And I found that when you get to too many buys, it starts to discredit the authenticity of the story. So like, for instance, in something like Pushing Daisies, which already was a heightened world and made no attempts to be realistic whatsoever, we could break into a musical sequence and you'd be like, oh, okay, well, there's such a big dollop of gravy over that meat that it brings everything together and makes it cohesive. But everything about The Expanse has been about science reality and science, you know, not necessarily, it's not necessarily fiction, but science reality adjacent. And that's one of the things I think that the sobriety of the storytelling on that level, and the embracing of this is our rule, this is real, our big buy is that we're in space, everything else has to conform to the things that we understand about human behavior. And I think that's one of the reasons The Expanse is so wonderfully realized, is that they're not distracted with bells and whistles. And I think sometimes when you're in episode 180 of a TV show and you're like, oh my God, well, let's just do a musical because I can't bear to have these people sit and talk about a case that they're investigating for another scene. I don't know how to write that. So let's just have them break into song. I get those instincts, and they are interesting parameters because I like musicals, but I like horror musicals. I like Sweeney Todd. I like Little Shop of Horrors. I'm more Sondheim than Andrew Lloyd Webber, I would say. But I like it when things have elements of other things that I love. Like I love that there's a plant-eating monster in Little Shop of Horrors. I love that as a kid, when I saw Sweeney Todd and I was like, oh, it's the musical, and I was like, wait, they're eating people? I'm in. You know, so it just depends on what is currency for you as an audience member.
Yeah. So you know, I've got to ask, because obviously, you know, with Space Rocks, we're all about you know, just bringing worlds together. I mean, you know, we've all lived during the space age. Did you grow up fascinated or kind of interacting with what was actually going on in the worlds of, you know, exploration, innovation? I mean, we're talking on the 30th anniversary of a Hubble Space Telescope, which, if anything, is responsible for doing so much to kind of show us new views of the universe, you know, that we simply never had before. Did you grow up interacting with that as well, or were you strictly in the world of sci-fi?
No, I was definitely aware of it. I was like, I had an impatience with it. Like I was interested in it and I was fascinated with it, and I was frustrated that it wasn't further along in its science to get us to the places that I was experiencing in my entertainment. But I know exactly where I was when they activated the Hubble. I know exactly where I was when the Challenger happened. You know, like all of those things are distinctive memories of, oh wow, something's happening, and you know, something wonderful, to quote 2010, not 2001, but 2010. But which I still like. It's that sentimental thing. But I think that like for me, I love bridging the gap between them, and you know, recent projects that I worked on. There's this wonderful group called the Science and Entertainment Exchange that is a resource for writers who can email Rick Lovert at the Science and Entertainment Exchange and say, I need to figure out faster than light travel in a way that we've not seen before. And, you know, I don't want to do warp. I don't want to do anything that is just about really fast engines with super gas. Like, what's the next level? And then he would say, Bryan, meet Spiros Malachis? It's Greek. who is a theoretical physician, who then can sit with me and we can talk about like, okay, how are all the, like, this faster than light travel has to be something completely alien, something outside of our perspective. What could it be? And then we have these wonderful imaginative conversations where we have a theoretical physicist talking to an imaginative writer, and you're coming up with something that you haven't seen before. I haven't seen it before, but somebody else might have been like, oh, you're just doing that other thing. But that's kind of the exciting thing for me as a writer, is to bridge that gap and sort of say, and talk to people who do science as a living and can make my world building more authentic by talking to them, whether it's Spiros or talking to somebody who is a SETI scientist and talking about like, okay, what would an alien have to say to you to convince you that they were actually an alien, to understand how intelligence works in the universe. And I was speaking to the scientist from SETI, and his response was they would have to talk about intelligence in the universe in a way that doesn't involve sacks of meat. And, you know, we are getting into a greater understanding of what intelligence is just by our exploration with the animal kingdom, and extrapolating that information into what could possibly be outside of our sphere of awareness. And he spoke a lot about artificial intelligence being not this villainous source of mankind's ultimate undoing, but a great resource for us to adapt the way that we are looking at our own intelligence, and to be more accepting and empathetic with things that don't look like us and aren't as vulnerable as us, so they don't have the defenses that we need as meat sacks that can be blown apart and impaired by a virus or what have you. And so that was really, that part of my job is the best part, because I'm not necessarily trying to solve a problem. I'm just learning from people who know a lot more than I do, and it's wonderful. So it's the best part of being a writer is the research.
I've done some script consulting with various people, and of course, you kind of have to have not a contract exactly, but up front you need to say, well, are you actually just looking for sort of science as a buttress, which you're going to ignore when it's convenient, or are you actually going to go with it, right? Because, you know, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with fantasy, absolutely fine, right? But don't back it up with the science, or cover it with science if you're not going to go that way. And, you know, Alex knows one of my sort of, and we have a good friend who worked on it very closely, on Interstellar, right? I mean, Interstellar has an enormous amount of kind of high concept baggage about black holes, and Kip Thorne, Nobel Prize winner, was involved, and the whole thing. And yet in the end, it comes down to love and being in a library somewhere inside a black hole. So, you know, well, yeah, it kind of lost me. But yeah, I mean, just for you, here's an idea, because I'm not sure it ever got made into anything. There was one where there was was a very real world scenario. So no science fiction at all, but it involved getting to the space station and having an astronaut who was stuck there kind of under quarantine, but because they went up pregnant. I never signed an NDA on this, so I can say this. And they didn't know they were pregnant, but they got on the station and they couldn't come back. And at some point, you know, the whole story comes to the end where the woman actually gives birth on the space station. And I'm thinking, to the writers, it was all very nice and delicate. I'm thinking, have you actually watched Alien? Do you have any idea what that's going to be like, with blood all over the walls? I mean, you know, it's not going to be nicely controlled, this scenario here.
Right.
But I wanted to pick up on...
You need the vacuum tube to be sucking up all of to try to have the baby. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on something which actually is almost a problem for us sometimes, is that what you and the special effects guys, the people that actually put the films physically into our eyeballs now, so compelling stories have been there for a long time, and they can draw us in, right? But if you add the visual, there's a point at which you're on the tipping point in believing it's real.
Right.
And particularly if it goes into virtual reality. I mean, I've experienced virtual reality stories where You know, the vestibular system is engaged, the pictures are good enough, the story is compelling, you're there, right? You know, you will not jump off that cliff in virtual reality, even though you know it's not real. The whole system is saying that it doesn't exist. And I do worry at some level that, you know, your industry, the creatives, are going to get to the point where you create a universe which everybody's going to want to go into, but not come out of again, because the real one is actually more disappointing than the one which you can create. And in a minor way, we get that. You know, you get what it's disappointing that we haven't gone to Mars. It's disappointing that we don't have faster than light travel. And we occasionally get criticized for being very conservative and very boring. And why haven't you solved this? And our only answer is, well, physics.
Right.
And money to some extent, and politics. I mean, they're all involved. But when it's physics, what can we do, really, right? So, yeah, I'm fascinated by science fiction, but also slightly frightened that it might take away what we're really doing in space sometimes, because it's almost never as exciting as it can be on the big screen in the cinema or on the television these days.
Well, I think what's wonderful about cinema and experiencing something through that lens is that the lens is controlled, like the point of view is controlled. So we have, depending on the filmmaker and their awareness of what to do with the camera to heighten certain emotions or certain experiences, there's always going to be a greater romance to seeing it through somebody else's lens with the score and all of those aspects to it. And I think, you know, your concern is a very valid one, because we've seen, you know, whether it's Ready Player One or, you know, worlds in which that humanity gets stuck in a virtual environment because the real environment is not interesting enough for them or too dangerous for them. And it's a slippery slope, because I think we are at a place, particularly now when we're seeing such great environmental shifts without the destructive presence of mankind, that the world is a beautiful place. But in order for it to stay beautiful, we have to get the fuck out of it and let it be. So that to me says, you know, is there a way to bridge that gap where we are able to experience things virtually for the sake of not disturbing them, for the sake of not, you know, for the prime directive of non-interference. And I think that's the big lesson that we have to learn environmentally, is how not to interfere. Like I can't see an orangutan battling a bulldozer without wanting every fucking human being on the planet to drop dead. You know, it's hard not to say, it's hard not to see a path forward where we're not being destructive. And so I think we have to be hyper vigilant. So I think there's a way to use that virtual experience to say, like, look, but don't touch. Like they don't like it works better without our footprints, like trampling through the bee food that is sustaining our planet. So there's a horror movie version of that where we become isolated and insulated and removed from the world. And then there's a wonderful aspect of that where we remove ourselves from the world to allow the world to get to a place where it can heal itself. So when we do re-engage with it, we are learned about what things we can do and what things we can't do to have a negative impact. So like I see two versions of the concern that you're bringing to our attention, and one of them I think, like, well, maybe we do need to go down that road because the alternative is just bad. I mean, living in Los Angeles and seeing clear skies and feeling being able to smell ozone in the air as opposed to trash is delightful. So we need science to help us get back to a purer place in a way.
Yeah, I mean,
like all of our fears. Pardon?
I was going to have this sort of personal idea that there's a competition between, if you think in terms of our business going into space, will the technology be there? Which one will be there first? The ability to actually send millions of people to Mars, or people being there without the danger of a 9-month journey and takeoffs and landings and everything else? People may want to go there, but they don't really want the hardship that's going to go with it. Some will. There will always be a few people, but most people will be perfectly happy to sort of drop into it for the afternoon. Hey, I'm on Mars, and then come straight back out again. So
and the only way to do that is a holodeck.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think, the holodeck exists within the context, because that's a weird inversion, because that's being out in space and coming back to Earth. The question is, will we go into space without actually going there, by being able to create the environments? We maybe send our robots to all of these places, but do humans really want to go to Mars? Beyond the explorers, do we as a civilization or as a species want to live on Mars?
I personally don't. I like glamping. Like I like hot and cold running water and knowing where my food is coming from. So I'm not interested in a wild, wild west scenario. I get the romance of it and how that has a narrative place, but I'm very comfortable knowing where my food is and that it's renewable in some aspect. So I think that's why we have all of these stories now, like talking about future alien movies and sort of colony stories that they were starting to get into with the last movie. The colonization aspect of it is so fascinating, because we have a fundamental problem on planet Earth, is that we are overpopulated. And we are going to run out of resources, and then you see the power of the planet when it is not being barraged by human interference, how quickly it can heal itself. And it does give you great hope, but that requires everybody to sit on the bench for a while. And will we do that? I don't know. I don't like, we're looking at people who are attacking cell towers, and as a species we're pretty dumb. Like we are not created equal in any way, shape, or form. I remember my big takeaway after graduating high school, like all of the kids were sitting down talking to our English teacher, and the wisest thing that she said is like, you all are not created equal. Like, some of you are rock stupid and some of you are brilliant, and that's the world, and it's going to be frustrating. So, but I keep on thinking, I have to remind myself of that all the time. It's like, we're not created equal. We're not like, we are not universally intelligent. There's a lot of us that are really stupid, and we have examples of it doing press conferences from the White House every day. So it's hard to have hope for humanity when there's so much of us that you're like, well, the world would be better off without us.
Yeah, I flipped that around and have decided that the most important lesson I can teach my kids is that other people are not like you. And I don't mean that in a good or bad way. It's just, don't assume that anybody thinks the same way you do just because you think that way. It's not, there are common strands, but there are so many differences. We all throw our hands up and say, how is it possible that? It's like, well, because we don't all think the same.
Right. Yeah, well, I have to say, Bryan, this time is absolutely flown, and I got to say, I feel like we could just chat for hours. But before we go any further, I've got to bring in some of our wonderful audience who've been watching patiently with a few other questions, and so there are a few great ones. But the first one is actually kind of funny, but it's one that I wanted to ask as well. Actually, one of our friends, Loretta Whitesides, the founder of Yuri's Night, has been watching, and she's asking, what are you wearing? What's this?
I wore it appropriately for the conversation. It's a space shirt.
Space shirts are good.
I have an astronaut on it. I was like, I got a dress for the occasion.
No, we're duly impressed. It's a good shirt. Alex wants to know. So you mentioned being on deadline through to June, and you're more or less in the space capsule right now. So what are you actually working on? What's keeping you busy?
I'm working on it's always so interesting whenever you're working on an IP project. I'm working on a horror movie for Universal, and I think that's all I can say. But I'm very excited about it.
Okay. Very good. A quick follow-up one. You know, I mean, you've done so much to create worlds. What great adaptation stroke reboot would you love to helm?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I do feel like I want to see another Alien movie with Ripley. I think what's so wonderful about Alien 3 and to a lesser extent Alien 4 is that they're so wildly implausible in many ways and don't necessarily adhere to any kind of strict logic that I'm like, well, those are just like hypersleep dreams. Let's get back to Ripley and Newt. Like I would love to see that story. I would love to see, like, I'm a big horror movie fan. I would love to see you know, a treatise on Mrs. Voorhees in a way that we haven't seen before. You know, like if I could do a remake of almost any movie, because I think to remake a movie, you have to take a movie that wasn't perfect. Like years ago, I was approached and somebody said, you know, we have the rights to Poltergeist. Do you want to do a remake of Poltergeist? And I was like, no, it's a perfect movie. I don't want to touch it. Like there's no way to win that war. So for me, I would love to do Halloween 3 Season of the Witch because it's a flawed movie, but it's a great concept. And so, you know, those are the kind of weird places that my mind goes. I feel like, you know, I would love to do a Star Wars film. I would love to do an Alien film. I would love to do a Star Trek film. You know, there's not a lot that I don't fantasize about doing with the action figures on my desk.
Walk us through for a minute, would you? What's your favorite? What do you got around you?
Oh gosh, like I've got, like, there's the Star Wars one. There's this like weird Pikachu Xenu. There's a, you know, this is my letter opener. So like it's I've got Jason Voorhees, like it's like I've just got like everybody. You know, it's a smorgasbord of pop culture kind of inspirations on my desk. And you know, in my office, I've got a lot of the toys that I coveted as a child because it's kind of a constant reminder of why I'm telling stories, is because it appeals to this wonderful sense of awe that is childlike, and I don't ever want to let go of that. So I have, you know, Buck Rogers action figures and Black Hole action figures. Oh, that's another one that I would love to do. Black Hole. I think that's such a it's a flawed movie, but the plot of it is kind of great. I mean, it's very Captain Nemo in space, but I love the production design for that film. And you know, I think there are certain things that are hard to touch. Like I wouldn't want to touch The Shining because I think it's an odd film, but it's a favorite film, and I'm competitive, so I wouldn't want to do something unless I could do it in a worthy fashion, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Bryan, it's been such an absolute pleasure to chat with you. On behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, everyone who has joined us today, can I say what an absolute pleasure it was to share this time with you. Stay safe out there, and thanks so much once again.
Thank you for having me. It was nice talking to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, we have one thing. I can't actually see that on video anymore. But remember, Alex, we always finish with the same thing.
We've got one thing.
Always finish with our Space Rocks hand signal. Of course, you know exactly how to do it, Bryan. Space Rocks.
Yeah. So yeah, right hand.
The Vulcan salute and the horns. Space Rocks. And Alex still hasn't got his thumb in the right place on the Vulcan salute. You'll learn.
Years of doing it badly. Very good. All right, Bryan.
Anyway, thank you very much. Yes, from my side too.
Much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.